He's teaching this quarter. What we name?
No, you can do it.
What we doing?
Count.
Are you a sub tonight, or are you?
He's tagged in. We didn't think David was going to be here. We thought it was just going to be us two. So. That's a good question. Yeah, I agree.
I think it's good to see
Is
you.
it honest to wear a t-shirt when you teach?
Johnny Cash over here.
If you
Zip up your little sweatshirt.
wear a black jacket over it, dress it
Classy.
dress it up.
Classy, baby.
All conversation. It's good to be alive.
Poured out like wine, baby.
I'm telling you, man. I can like
It's
that
a
song.
good song. Have you never
Monica
heard it?
and I neither one have. So you're talking about, I mean,
Oh, yeah. Yep.
two different areas of the country. And I'm like, have you ever heard this song? She's like, no, I don't have heard it.
Well, she's been living it last year, so now, like, in her practice and stuff. She's full of
I
confidence.
think she
You know?
hadn't heard it. Maybe she just missed the one that she did. I don't know.
Yeah.
The last one, she was talking about doing someone. Oh, something about the Master of the Tempest is Raging. She wanted to lead that one. And I'm like, goodness, this girl's ambitious.
Well, you know.
Yeah,
it's
we're ready. You ready? We're live. We're live. Okay, let's go.
All right.
All right. Everybody got handouts? You're doing the intro. I'm handing off to my friend here on my left, who came today after all.
Line it.
We'll just wait for a couple to come in and then we'll start.
Yeah, we need to Ashley.
We don't
Ashley
mind
needs,
waiting on you to
Ashley
come
needs
in
to hear
and
this
have
list. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. We're talking about modesty. I don't know. I was just joking.
Wow.
No, I'm not calling you.
Oh, glad you're here. I'm just going to leave. Is that it?
All right, does everybody have their workbook, pamphlets? We'll go ahead and get started. It's an interesting topic that we will look at tonight. It's one that certainly is a cultural issue, and one I think that throughout generations has certainly had an impact in the church and amongst families. Interesting for me is I have just flown back from LA, the week of the Grammys, and being a part and seeing what is there. Modesty might be
Oh, it's not there.
what is not there either. Might be defined differently. As where someone might have grown up in Hartselle, Alabama, or down in Foley, Alabama, or the middle country of Georgia, or someone that has been blessed with being raised in the church from infancy. So, who defines what modesty is? You can certainly look at history, and you can even see in the evolution of paintings what might be modest and what might not be. What might be considered art, and what might be considered pornography. And are these conversations that we have and don't have, and is it just deal with the idea of what we wear? Is that all that modesty is? How would you define modesty before we even start? What would you say modesty is?
Oh, gee.
What you wear and why you wear it.
Okay.
It's an appropriate way to present yourself.
Okay.
It's more than just your outfit, your clothing. It's also your attitude and your demeanor.
Okay, so it's more than maybe just the physical apparel that dresses your body. It certainly does. And I think what may most be visibly seen is that which we adorn ourselves with. Right? It's what we look at in the mirror. It's what we present ourselves to ourselves before we present ourselves to the world. That which is external. But it certainly is more than that. The idea of modesty, it means choosing morally that which is appropriate behavior. And it can be derived even from the Latin word modestus, which means just keeping up in measure. What's an appropriate measure? You know, if you look at Scripture, we're warned about different things of modesty, right? You're warned about being gluttonous, right? Do we ever think about being modest in what we eat? Are we living in a society and a culture where things are no longer immodest? You know, Jeremiah 6:15 talks about, you can turn there, and I don't know if we're not a culture that's far away from this. Think about this for yourselves. When was the last time that you blushed? In 15 of chapter 6 of Jeremiah, they were ashamed because of the abomination they have done. They were not even ashamed. The question was, were they ashamed? They were not even ashamed at all. They did not even know how to blush. Therefore, they shall fall among those who I fall and punish them. Whatever the abomination is. Sin is that abomination. Does the idea of modesty, is it sinful? Where is that line of sin? You know, we are a called out people, right? We are supposed to be what? We have words that are given us. We're supposed to be set apart. We're supposed to be peculiar. We're supposed to be not of the world. We're supposed to be what? Transformed, renewing our minds. Turn with me here in Genesis. Another question that I kind of think might be good for us to begin here within the class, and maybe the easiest in the beginning, right? God made them both male and female, and He put them in the most perfect setting that could be created. That which was perfect, this is where Adam and Eve lived. Eden. Until what? Until sin separated them from God. But a part of this sin separation of God, there was some exposure, something new that came that they were unaware of. And if you look in verse 7 of chapter 3, what do you discover in verse 7 of chapter 3?
Adam and Eve knowing they're naked, so they make clothes.
Then their eyes were both opened, and they knew that they were naked. Something new was exposed to them. Sin had exposed something which was not perfect. And they were what? They realized their nakedness. Later on, you see that God asked why they were hiding. You see kind of the excuse, well, we were without clothes, they were naked. But you see also here in verse 7 what? They had an opportunity. They felt naked. They felt immodest, right? Something different from the nature that was given to them. And they what? Had an opportunity, and they clothed themselves. What? Their own fig leaves, right? They gathered what they had. They thought that this was an appropriate clothing. Until verse 21. And what do you see in verse 21? Was their clothing or adorning of themselves that which was modest in God's eye?
No.
What do you see here in 21?
God made them tunics of skin.
So that which man created for himself was not adequate. So in a culture that we live in today, that we are impacted, right? We talk about the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, that which we put in. Think about the movies that you see or choose to see, right? There are things that we cannot unsee. Davis talks about, we learned it, I think, first from Melvin, the things that you see that you ought not to see, well, you better turn around and bounce. Right? Let's remove ourselves from this idea of unhealthy seeing. How do you keep yourself pure? Billy and I have talked about before the idea of a pure virgin. Right? There's a purity of God that He looks for us beyond even man's comprehension. So the class today is really for us to look at and talk about the idea of modesty. Are we a pure people?
I want to ask a follow-up question as you're getting your definition for modesty. Multiple of you noted that, all right, it's more than just clothing, it's attitude as well. Have you seen a shift in that focus? Or is there a certain group of people that focus on one over the other? What have you noticed when it comes to this topic? of, is it all about clothing or is it all about attitude? Is it balance? And have you seen somebody focus on one more than the other? What would you say?
I feel like it's usually what people wear to church and wear in public.
Okay. All right. What else would you say? Do you hear a lot of people talk about the attitude being more important than what you wear? No? Is it a one-to-one balance or what?
It's definitely more like talking about what you wear heavy. Like when the topic that we're talking about modesty, the first thing that popped in my mind was, okay, they're gonna talk about what you should and shouldn't wear.
Okay. And is that just an in-house Christian conversation we have, or are other people having that conversation as well outside of Christianity?
Easier maybe. Is it only fathers that care about their daughters in the church? Or is it fathers that care about their daughters not in the church also? Or likewise, is it parents of children not in the church and parents? And we fool ourselves to think, guys, that it's just with us, right? We're not talking about just the weakness of man's flesh. We're talking about the modesty of all of ourselves and how we adorn all of ourselves.
Yeah, because isn't it interesting? It was, last week Jason was in chapel at Faulkner, and he was talking about, it seems abnormal that somebody would want to stand in front of people naked. But I think there was something recently that happened that was a little scandalous, right, in public, of somebody being open, right? There's something going on there. Maybe it was at the Grammys, something like that. I don't know who was there. But anyways, something like that, where people looking at that and saying, okay, that's not the right thing to do. Right? There was something that was inappropriate about how somebody was presenting themselves. Is this just a conversation that Christians have? Or is this something our world is looking at as a whole, saying, all right, do we need to be more aware of how we act and what we do and what we wear? It should be all of those together, right?
I feel like it's been a big debate in our schools,
Okay.
where you have the authorities and principals and everybody saying like, you have a dress code, you have to follow it, and it seems to be the more liberal-minded people are saying, well, like, it's just how I express myself, and that could be their version of like breaking the dress code and immodesty, or it could actually be modesty.
Okay. Yeah, because some schools have uniforms, right? It's not just the private Christian schools. There are others that have uniforms as well. There's some kind of standard there. You may have a job that's going to have a uniform that you're supposed to wear. And if somebody came in and it's like, well, I just don't want to wear that. I'm going to wear something else. Is that allowed? Do you get to do that? So I know because there's something that's appropriate to the setting. There's something that's determined that you need to do. And if somebody wants to come and just, express their own personality in a different way, sorry, but, you work at Chick-fil-A, this is what you've got to wear when you're going to work at Chick-fil-A, right? There's just a uniform, there's an appropriateness, there's a setting that you are in. And so we see it even outside of Christianity. There are things that you should and should not wear. There are settings that you're going to be in that you're supposed to act in a certain way and not act. Now, what makes Christianity stand out differently though, with this kind of topic? Is it that we're more strict than the world? Well, that should be a general rule of thumb, that we notice that Christianity is more reined in than the world. And it's not just, we're not talking about just clothing, we're talking about attitude and everything. But how should Christians stand out uniquely when it comes to this topic? And we're noting both what you wear and how you act, right? And who you are. That should stand out differently as a Christian.
How many of y'all have had a class before talking about modesty, just out of curiosity? Couple? That's good. Okay. I was talking to my wife about this before we came to today. And she said she didn't really remember a whole lot of modesty classes that she grew up until later on in life, and she remembers going to one. And she said what always stuck with her in her mind is the idea of considering why you're doing something more with regard to modesty. And I think that's one thing we're going to talk about as we kind of think about this defining modesty is what is the why behind it. If you're wearing something, we're talking about wearing clothes, if you're wearing something just to get attention, that should tell you something right there with regard to it. By the way, clothing was never designed by God to be something to bring attention to you. And so if you're doing something just to bring attention to you, then you may need to second guess that. It was a functional thing for one thing in Genesis chapter 3, right? Because they were naked, they needed to be clothed. They had shame. God ended up giving them a better clothing to cover their shame. You go on and look at other places in the scriptures, and there's some idea about the clothing being appropriate for that setting or for that activity. And so it really is not bringing attention to yourself. And I thought that was kind of interesting from her point of view, the idea of the why behind it. And that kind of goes with not just wearing clothes, but it's everything when you think about modesty. And you think about how we're thinking about these definitions and how we're thinking about what we mean here. Real quickly, what we want to do is kind of jump into these five. There's 5 different little areas on the front of your hand that you see on the front left there that I think is good for us to kind of go over and look at some quick scriptures here about these. As you think about what do we mean by defining modesty? Well, I think it's a little bit more than just the idea of clothes. And I think, like you said, when you came in here thinking we're going to talk modesty, obviously a lot of y'all have already thought about it, that it's a much bigger concept than just clothing. Although it is clothing, it's everything that you got to think about. But the modesty is defined by the World English Dictionary as not ostentatious or pretentious, decorous or decent, not extreme or excessive, moderate. And so when you think about that in conjunction with some of the scriptures that we read about modesty, it hopefully will give us kind of an idea a little bit more about what are we talking about modesty. And so let's look at some scriptural foundation for some of these things, the different components of modesty. The first thing that we kind of talk about is decent. And so that's kind of part of the definition. We've already talked about Genesis chapter 3, but it's the idea of having a covering or having something about us because of a concern for morality, staying respectable, considering man's nakedness, women's nakedness. I'm not just trying to say man is the only one, but I mean, the idea there that we are decent. I don't know if y'all, it's kind of an older phrase, but some people say I can't come to the door because I'm not decent. You ever heard that? And the whole point is they're not really ready to face whoever's at the front door of the home because they're not appropriate with regard to their clothing and the morality of trying to cover up what is naked and the way we are. We already talked about Genesis chapter 3, 7, and 21. Genesis chapter 9, verse 8 is very interesting. After the flood, y'all remember what happened after the flood? What? Noah got drunk, that's right. And Noah, this great man of faith, right? He had his faults and flaws too. And this is one of them we see at the end of the flood, chapter 9, after it occurred. And you see in chapter 9 where the rainbow came out. What happens after that, after he gets drunk? What do? Do you remember what his sons did?
They took clothes and covered him.
Right, they covered him. Why? Because he wasn't decent. He had gotten drunk, out of his mind, could not cover himself up. So his sons actually took clothing to cover him up. And so you see that in Genesis there as a good principle there, that needs to be done and covered so that you're decent. And the other verse, Luke chapter 8, if you want to flip over there real quick. But Luke 8 talks about there in verse 26 and 28, I think, somewhere in there. All right, yeah, this is the demonic. I was trying to remember this one. So you had the guy that was possessed by all the demons here in verse 26. And what you see is the fact, how was he found? Verse 27, what was one of the identifying characteristics of this guy who was possessed by demons?
He has naked clothes.
All right, he had not put on any clothing for a long time and was not living in a house but in the tombs. And then we see a drastic difference, by the way. After the demons left, what happens? He clothes himself. Because when you're of your right mind, the mentality is that you want to cover and be decent. And so that's kind of the concept there of modesty. Adequate. This is where I think we get into some debate. The idea of what is modest is what is adequate sometimes. What is sufficient or enough coverage for some need or requirement. So what is adequate with regard to modesty? That's where our discussion is come into play. Y'all agree with me? Sometimes what shorts are too short? What skirts are too, and again, that, by the way, applies for boys and girls. Amazingly nowadays. I've never really thought I'd be dealing with the shorty shorts again with the boys, but you have that even in today's culture sometimes.
Well, and don't even forget to question the idea, we're just a few decades removed, are shorts even okay?
Right, yeah.
Or are pants even
Right.
okay?
What is adequate? And I think we've got to be careful and cautious as we think about this concept. One, does culture play a role in this? What do y'all say about that? I think it can. And I'm not saying that that there's an absolute standard all the time with regard to it. However, I think that you can see that in the scriptures when you deal with covering your nakedness, that there is something that's said there with regard to making sure that you are properly and adequately covered, making sure that things are not showing, your flesh is not showing in ways that would present you as being someone maybe of the devil, or being someone who does not care about being covered up. And so those kind of extremes, of course, are things to be cautious and careful about. There's also the extreme of going too far. Man, is anybody going to come in here in a tux tonight? And would that be a little bit more than what was adequate? I would say probably. And so adequacy, sometimes, and that may be appropriate too when we get down to suitable and appropriate, those kind of concepts. But, there's an idea that being adequate is something making sure that there is enough there and not going to the extreme necessarily on either respect. Not too little, not too much. There's a couple of Genesis 3:7, we talked about that already. The idea that what man did was not adequate. They put together some coverage of leaves, we believe, right? That's what it says. And then God said, I'm going to make you something out of skin. And he gave them animal skin coverings. And so the rationale there is what you had was not good enough. It was not adequate enough. So do we know that it's because it wasn't going to be sustainable, or maybe it didn't cover enough? Maybe it wasn't covering them appropriately. God gave them more adequate clothing.
And even think about maybe some regular application. The idea of a maturing mind. The idea of parents dressing you as you were younger. What Billy and Shelby are doing is the kids think that what's adequate to go outside of the house. It's probably more than a diaper, Lewis. Are we maturing in that idea of adequacy?
Right. And I think there is something to be said about maybe culture's influence on that perception of what is adequate. But there's also the biblical principles that we've also got to balance there. Does that make sense to you? And so obviously, if you're coming to church services and you're wearing shorts, is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, it may not be a bad thing. It may be completely adequate for the circumstances. But it may not be adequate under some circumstances. And so again, I'm not saying it's always circumstantial, but there is a question of whether or not, hey, are those shorts long enough? Are they covering what they need to be covering enough? Covering the nakedness? Because, if you ever have clothing, again, and I have 2 daughters, so that's one of our biggest concerns is things being cut too low, cut too tight, cut too short. You've got that constant pressures around you in the world to have that kind of clothing, or that's what they sell in the world, unfortunately. And so you're constantly struggling with that because you want to make sure what you purchase or what you have on your bodies is in fact adequate. And so there are some scriptures there that we put, Proverbs 17, I think 10, is it the one? No, that's not the one. I have the wrong verse down.
Proverbs 17?
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, there you go, yeah. And behold, a woman comes to meet him dressed as a harlot and cunning of heart. Now, what's interesting when you talk about harlots in the Old Testament, that they always, I say always, that's a strong word to use. Almost always, I'll put it that way. There's probably some that don't. But they always talk about how they dressed. Have you ever noticed that or heard that? It's the idea of you're dressing as a harlot. And so whether it's the story of, was it Judah and Tamar, or whether it was this, just this proverb here, you have someone that is dressed in a certain way, maybe wearing a certain color that would indicate what they were professionally. Their hair was a certain way. All those kind of things could be. So again, the idea of adequate could come into play in making sure that what you're wearing is in contrast to those things which are not adequate.
Those seem to be, is that not subjective? Just thinking about
Well, I think
responses
so.
to it. It's like, all right, what somebody may consider to be adequate might be inadequate for somebody else. Or you're talking about coming to the door, decent. There's a couple here that, older couple, and the sun hadn't even gone down. It was 6 o'clock anyways. I had made some homemade salsa, and I was texting them, I'd love to have some. I was like, well, I can just swing by. I'm already out, delivering some others. And they said, sorry, we're already in our pajamas and, we're not decent. Now for him, because he's like, well, you know what, I'll just come to the door, because he was wearing full flannel, long sleeve pants and everything. But for him, he considered that to be, indecent. It's just another guy coming to the door, so he was okay with that. But what about the subjective nature of this? How do you help people take principles like this and navigate through, well, what you may consider to be adequate may not be, or on the other extreme of it? Because even the attitude, right, of like what we wear, if somebody comes in and they're wearing, like what I'm wearing, is this adequate for the night? When I look around at the setting and see different people, is this too much? So,
Man, I think there's always going to be some leeway given to some extent there, and some differences. I don't think this is one of those things where I can say, here's a bright line necessarily of 100% this is decent right here. But on the other hand, I mean, you might be able to somewhat say that, because are you covering up nakedness? Is the decency?
and that's the question, is like, what is nakedness? What would y'all say? Like, if you're gonna say adequate, because I think that's right on the right track. It's like, we got to cover up nakedness. What would that be? Like, is that inches from the knee? Is it a certain body part that is exposed or not exposed? What would we consider to be naked? Think about Adam and Eve. They sewed fig leaves together. That's all we got. We don't know what that was covering or not covering, that they then were gifted, from God, other clothing. But what would be just talking about, all right, we need to cover up nakedness. Is it come down to a certain part of the body, or how much of the body is exposed? Is it a percentage? What would that be necessarily?
What do y'all think?
We're adults, so
We can talk about it.
we're talking about modesty and we're adults.
Man,
Okay, so.
Obviously, I always start with, I think about it as when we're children, we're talking about our children, is that everybody has the private parts. And I think obviously that needs to be covered up. That's just a culturally acceptable, I think, something that everybody understands that. Now, then that goes how far or how much has to be covered up. And I think I always go back to this, is whenever I look or see someone or see clothes on my children and I'm like, I don't know about that. That to me means there's probably something wrong with that. When we're trying on dresses and they're like, okay, is this too short or not short? We're not getting a ruler out necessarily. I mean, I guess we could. Freed Hardeman's what, a credit card? Is that what it is for the knee?
Camp doesn't have
And ICYC's you got to go all the way down to the knee with your shorts. So I mean, you got those dress codes. I don't know what's Faulkner. Is there a dress code at Faulkner?
What's on the books?
What's on the books, whether it's applied or not?
I know what you're thinking, but what's on the books? Do what? Credit card?
Credit card?
Is that's for both men and women? Yes. Right? Yeah. Trying to be consistent there. Now, the application, that's always with the law, right? Is the application and institution of enforcing it.
Now, maybe the real question should be, what is your response or thought to it? The idea of some idea of adequate modesty being asked, is it received with objection? Or is it received with understanding?
So, but you're talking about like social context. If I go to the beach, it's socially acceptable to wear a bathing suit.
Socially
But
acceptable
is
wearing
that
nothing.
socially acceptable for us?
Practically there.
All right, so let's ask,
That's not. I think that's a good consideration. I think that's where you get into these other factors.
well, let's ask, it's one of our questions, our
Yeah,
discussion
that's
question.
the
It is.
So
discussion
here's a
question.
discussion question. Does it matter what you wear based on where you are? Example, at the beach, at the mountains, in the north,
On a
in the
mission
south, in the west, in the south,
In
in the east?
Africa,
In what country?
what you tell us. What do you think how does it reflect?
Is there
on
such a
us
thing as
Christians?
situational modesty?
Yeah.
There probably shouldn't be, but there definitely is. Like when you're an adult,
From who? Are we talking about
The
ourselves
world
or
or
are we
the
talking about the
Christian?
world?
I'd say from like a Christian perspective, like if you say like growing up to the beach or growing up going to the beach, you always wore swim trunks, you didn't have to wear your shirt, you could go whatever. But we see like when I was an intern last summer, we went to the beach with our kids, that the kids had shorts, shirts, everybody had the same thing on. So there was situational modesty when you're in a youth group setting, that nobody had their shirts off or anything, but also we go out to the beach with non-church goers and their shirts off and everything. So there shouldn't be situational modesty, but there definitely is.
So,
Kind of, it's like the opposite end of the spectrum from a beach, because beach is like, with modesty, it's talking about lack of clothes.
But like, let's say you're going to a formal event, and you're supposed to wear a tux, and I show up with like sweatpants and a sweatshirt. I'm covering the same amount of like nakedness, I guess. But would that still be considered immodest because it's inappropriate to the
I
situation?
think that goes to the next term we haven't got to yet, because we've gotten to the adequate, but the idea of suitable. I mean, there's a suitability aspect of modesty, I believe, is that there, and I think that becomes a situational or circumstantial, because there is some respect that can be given to being varying modesty, maybe, depending on what would be suitable or situational in that situation.
It's not normally a surprise, right? It's usually black
Right.
tie or black tie optional.
Right.
Or if you're in the South and you're invited to a wedding that starts after 7, right? You're supposed to wear black ties. There's rules and invitations and identification on proper attire. So going back to the appropriateness of location, we're speaking about culture. Doesn't matter, because John may have an experience that is different than me. I know Christian families that don't go to the beach. Because why? Maybe a modesty issue of skin exposure. I know people that have always grown up wearing t-shirts and short swimming, males and females. So what we see is not always what everyone sees.
But you would also say too that like showing up to a black tie event wearing t-shirt and sweatpants is not sinful, right? You wouldn't call that sinful. But when we have these conversations, when it comes to covering up nakedness, you're talking about sinful and not sinful, right? I mean, there would be something there. And so when I think from a Christian standpoint, you know, we've got right and wrong. I put them in a system like that. You got right and wrong. You've got good and evil, and then you have wise and unwise. I think there's a lot of advice in Scripture that tells us how to live wise lives that would determine, all right, can we, you know, navigate around other people and it be okay in certain situations? That the book of Proverbs is filled with, if you were to sit down at a, you know, at a king's table, this is how you act. Like there's wise and unwise there, but when it comes to a topic, you know, we're dealing with nakedness and the appropriateness of how we live, you're in a different category, right? There's something when it comes to Scripture, what we see about this. And that's why, you know, looking at these other terms, and I'll kind of lump some of them together.
Yeah, we've kind of discussed.
Yeah, that's okay. The suitable, appropriate, and moderate. I want to use two, I'm going to consider them parallel passages. 1 Timothy chapter 2, because this is going to help us go to our definition that we saw earlier of what we wear, but also how we act. Two passages. One's going to be Paul to Timothy. The other one's going to be from Peter, okay? So let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. All right. Let's read, and somebody pick up in verse 8, 1 Timothy 2, verse 8, and go through 10.
I desire then that every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works.
You know, a lot of times when people look at this topic, you know, it's all about women and modesty. But I think what we're trying to show through Scripture and wise and unwise and start working from there, that there's a responsibility that all Christians have to show modesty in thought and in action as well as dress. When I come to this verse, though, this passage, there's a key term that helps me understand more what Paul is getting at when we're studying this. Look at the beginning of verse 9. What's the word there? Likewise. Now, how does that work in a grammatical construction? If you see the word likewise, what's happening?
It's connecting two clauses.
Okay, it's connecting two clauses. All right, so let's look at the first one. The advice that's given, we see beginning there in verse 8. I desire in every place that men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger and quarreling. Likewise, okay? How does the appropriateness of a man praying and in the type of way that he's praying, how is that like? And then you read the rest of the verse, or the passage. Also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with works. What's the connection? Why is the word likewise there? And what is Paul teaching us?
Is it basically like that's what's respectable in God's eyes?
Okay, all right, so let's hold that out. All right, what's respectable in God's eyes? What would that be? Like what do you note here that's respectable in God's eyes?
That the men should be the ones praying, and
Okay.
then that women should be dressing themselves respectful and modestly.
Okay, so prayer and clothing likewise.
Is it talking like specifically about how you approach God?
Okay, so how you approach God, all right? Because we can see here when you're praying, lifting holy hands, but also, looking at someone who professes godliness. Okay, maybe something there. What else would you say?
Is this talking about like when the church meets? Like, maybe not specifically, but like, the men come together, pray, and then the women that are there they've obviously been given authority to teach like men or to pray for everybody like men, so this is what they're to do whenever they're met with the church.
Okay, so if it were a church service, this is how it's supposed to look. Okay, what would you see connection-wise here?
It's about the focus of
Okay.
where people's focus, if it's, on trying to be impressive to others, or if it's on, pleasing God.
Okay. You see something here when he's talking about prayer in the first part of it. That's important. I think you can make a positive case here about prayer, men praying and leading prayer. I think that comes from here. But he also gives us an extra layer to it, doesn't he? If a man is leading prayer, but he doesn't have holy hands, he has anger, he has quarreling, is that, if he possesses those things while he's trying to pray, is that a good thing? No, what's going on underneath is inappropriate. It's not right. It's sinful. Like the attitude of the person, and it's also related to the external as well, right? We see people praying, we see people standing in the front, but if on the inside the motivation and things are wrong, then the outside's going to be wrong as well. All right. Now, if you carry that same kind of mentality over to verses 9 and 10, you're seeing the outward components, which are needing to be noted. I mean, nobody's going to get around this and say, okay, he's not talking about what is physical, but he's also talking about what is spiritual. Verse 10, what's going on underneath, behind the scenes, but what is proper for women who profess godliness. If you are a person who professes godliness, it is going to have an outward expression as well in how you present yourself. And you could have varying degrees. You have somebody that goes too far, hey, look at me. They walk in and all eyes turn. Is that for their attention or is it for anything else? And then on the other side, you could be immodest. You could have exposure of nakedness, things like this that is too far. You can be completely covered up and inappropriate, and you can be uncovered and inappropriate, right? If you're looking at what is going on here, there's an attitude that is part of it. And on a parallel passage with it, 1 Peter chapter 3, just so you can see how this goes. 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 6 is the full discussion there, talking about wives, but there's something about proper adorning and the attitude that goes along with it. And actually it goes down to verse 7 where he talks about husbands and wives and how you're supposed to act. There's an internal and there's an external. Christianity is filled with this kind of mentality. Right? The Sermon on the Mount talks about, all right, if you have salt that looks salty, but it doesn't actually have any saltiness, what is it good for?
Nothing.
To be thrown out, trampled on the ground underneath men's feet. I like the way that Luke says in Luke chapter 6, he said, throw it out and put it on the dung pile. Okay? It's not worth anything. So somebody can look right on the outside, but on the inside, everything's off. Now, on the other part of it, you get to illustration number 2. You are the light of the world. All right? A light's supposed to be for light in the room, but can a light be doing something wrong? Well, if it's to bring attention, because you get it in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, let your good works be seen for whose glory? Your glory or somebody else's? For God's glory, right? That's why we do things. We're a shining light. Not that people look at Billy and say, oh man, look how religious, look how good he is, that he did a good work. No, it's that God may have the glory. Now, the reason why we're putting these together, and I think help us understand these terms as a whole, is it is a combination of both what you wear and how you are as a person. There's a lot of attitude checks that need to go in. Let's be honest. You know that there's looking around here, we got mostly Faulkner students or have been associated with Faulkner. When you hear there's a dress code, that's so stupid. Man, why would they do that? You go on a youth trip, okay? Everybody wants to go on, the beach retreat. And it's like, hey, if we're going to go to the swimming pool, we're going to go down to the beach, we're going to wear dark shirts and shorts, that's for everybody. That's so dumb. Why would they do that? Is that a heart problem? Yeah. Those kind of things need to get in check. I think that's where we run into a lot of problems. Or even if you're at a church and you come in and maybe you're not used to just how culturally, even in the church, how things are, and somebody comes up to you, maybe you get to know them a little bit better, and they're like, hey, I noticed you've been wearing this on Sunday mornings. that's not really a good, maybe you need to pay attention to how you're dressing. I'm letting you use your imagination in that situation. Do you look at that and it's like, man, those old people, they're just trying to make things too difficult on us and just, they're too stuffy, they don't understand, or do you respect what people say? Do you see how that's an attitude problem? Those are the kind of things I think we need to get in check. There are more conversations we need to have with this when it comes to even what you wear, going all the way down to nakedness. I just think it's so interesting about the situational is that, all right, at the beach, and I grew up, somebody says, I grew up going to the beach, guys just wore shorts and girls, wore bathing suits. But, it's interesting, if you had just a basic bathing suit, what would be different than, underwear? It's like, those are about the same thing. So does situational change that? Or is there something that we see we're like, no, that needs to be covered up, and that's just not right? Now, do you have to have book, chapter, and verse, or can we have an understanding about how God's people are supposed to act and how they are to present themselves? And if we know that there is something that is referred to biblically and objectively as nakedness, wouldn't we want to figure out how to cover that up and be more appropriate with that?
Well, I think it goes back to the idea that God covered up their nakedness. All right, so if our intention is to wear as little as possible, then where is our goal? And I think it goes to the mindset, the check we got to have on our attitude with regard to, is that where our focus is? Let's see how little we can wear. I think that's going to be an issue for you on a much greater scale, realizing God wanted us to cover up. I mean, he himself made them clothes to cover up their nakedness. And I think that's pretty interesting. And I don't believe it was just some little loincloth. I don't believe that. I don't have proof of that. But I think when you look at everything else, look at the way that he dressed his priests. He dressed his priests from, top to bottom. They were covered, multi-layered. They wanted to make sure they weren't able to see up there whenever they were speaking. They wanted to make sure things were covered. It's
the guys were wearing skirts.
Yeah. So, again, I think those are things for us to consider and think about as a totality of everything. Can circumstances influence it? Yes. We're not saying they can't necessarily influence it, but should they influence it? Maybe not as much as we let them influence things. And that may be the check that we need to have in our lives to think about what we are doing. We didn't really get into the two different viewpoints tonight. Take them, study them, and look at them and see at these two different viewpoints, because one of them, viewpoint number one, whenever you're just pretty much excusing what you're wearing because, hey, it's on somebody else, what they think is not my problem, is again a total different mindset. What did God say our mindset should be? Not on ourselves, but what? On others. And so whenever, as a Christian, you're thinking about what you can do for others, why would you ever want to wear or do something that's going to cause someone else to stumble? Guy or girl, it doesn't matter. And so I think there's a lot of considerations for us to think about when it comes to modesty, because it goes much deeper than just the clothes we put on our bodies. It goes into what we are thinking in our minds.
And even your just body posture and everything too. We teach our kids the right way to sit in public. No, that may sound really dumb. Like, what are you talking about? My wife on a regular basis talks about, she went to Girls State and talked about like the right way to sit in a chair, whether you're wearing a dress or not. There's just a proper way to sit and an improper way. We try and teach our kids at a very young age how to do that. There's a lot of individual factors that go into it, but once again, I think it comes down to the mindset and the attitude. If we want to be open to discuss this, we want to be open to how we live as Christians among other people who are of the faith, but also are of the world. Is it the fact that Christianity can exist anywhere at any time and be appropriate and be shining lights? If we are clothing ourselves in Christ, right, that changes our attitude, it changes our presentation, it changes our speech, it changes our relationships, it permeates every component of our life. So to think that Christianity doesn't affect what we wear or how we act about that, I think we're missing a key component of Christianity, which is meant to touch every part of life.
You see the pattern of God's people and God's discipline. We talked about discipline and its encouragement. Christ has done this throughout Scripture, as his apostles. They both address the physical and the internal. So hopefully this class tonight has minimally got us to think about, and this should be a regular routine in all things. What am I about to do, or what I'm about to put on? Am I being modest in the things that I'm choosing to do as I represent God the family here at El Rado, and the church that he died for.
Well, and I think what he said about being clothed with Christ. Imagine if Christ was wearing what you're wearing. If Christ was doing what you're doing. If Christ was thinking what you were thinking, right? Y'all may not remember this, but they used to have a lot of bracelets that said WWJD. That was kind of a fad thing for a while, but it's what would Jesus do? Still applicable today. Because if we are clothing ourselves in Christ, our life better be exemplifying Christ. And I think that kind of a mindset's going to help change and form us in a whole lot better way than we can form ourselves. Next week, spring break, right? Y'all be safe. Come back to us safe. And we look
And he'll
forward
plan
to
this talk right before they went on spring
I
break. I
know,
see what you're
man.
doing.
Yeah.
That's fine.
That was Nate, no. No, but we will pick up, I guess, week after spring break and see what topic is then. So we'll see y'all then.
I have a question.
Shoot.
So, is dressing like with society standards of like stylish or trying to wear name brand things?